Now we will turn our attention to one of the most horrific sides of British colonization, namely the causes and effects of slavery in the various British colonial regions, and how those enslaved people responded to the conditions of slavery. Now, the first labor system used in the British colonies was indentured servitude, in which servants worked for landowners in exchange for passage to America. But because indentured servants only worked for a short period of time, and sometimes fought over access to land after their terms ended, plantation owners switched to using enslaved Africans as their primary source of labor. This was especially true after Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in 1676. There, disgruntled former indentured servants attacked neighboring Indian villages, then turned their attacks on the coastal elites of Virginia society, whose interests they believed were being favored over the needs of the residents in the western parts of the colony. Enslaved Africans soon became vital to the cultivation of tobacco and made up nearly 50% of the population in the Chesapeake and southern colonies by the mid-18th century. Slavery was extremely important to the British Empire, particularly in the 18th century. Every colony had enslaved people, from the southern rice plantations in Charlestown, South Carolina, to the northern port of Boston in Massachusetts. In the English colonies, the first use of enslaved labor started in the British West Indies to work tobacco and sugarcane plantations there. Even after the arrival of slaves to Virginia in 1619, the majority of enslaved Africans were still sent to the British West Indies. The Royal African Company transported 125,000 enslaved people between 1672 and 1713, primarily to the West Indies, on what was called the Middle Passage, the journey from the African coast to the Americas. This gruesome trip took around 6 weeks, in which about 20% of the slaves on board would die from disease, starvation, or even suicide. African slaves were chained below deck in putrid conditions and faced still more indignities upon arrival in the Americas, where they were auctioned off like livestock, separated from family and friends, often purposely kept with others who didn't speak the same language to make it more difficult for them to escape. Although slaves lived in all of the English colonies, the slave population was distributed differently across them. In New England, the farms were generally smaller, and thus they held fewer enslaved Africans. With larger family sizes, there was also usually numerous family members available to do household work and farm labor, but you did have some enslaved people working in these areas. Slaves also worked in the agricultural areas of the middle colonies, but since these were not producing cash crops that involved tremendous amounts of labor, they were less prevalent as farmhands and were instead more likely to be household servants. All of the major port cities, like New York City, did have significant numbers of enslaved people who worked as seamen and dock workers and general servants. Moving a little further south into the Chesapeake and southern colonies, these areas held far more enslaved people, which were needed for their growing plantation system that produced various cash crops that were very labor-intensive, like tobacco, indigo, and rice. And if you go even further south into the British West Indies, of course, you would find the greatest number of slaves ending up there because of the intense labor required of the sugarcane plantations. For the most part, the further south you went, the more they relied on slave labor. Now let's look at how the nature of slavery changed in the British colonies. As chattel slavery became the dominant labor system in many southern colonies, new laws created a strict racial system. This race-based system treated slaves as property, which is how the British justified keeping other people in bondage. Since the British West Indies were the leaders in the slave trade, their practices influenced how the institution was carried out elsewhere, especially in the southern colonies. Perhaps their most notable influence was the establishment of harsh slave laws to restrict the actions and behaviors of those held in slavery. In Virginia, for example, they followed the example of Barbados and enacted laws that legally defined African slave laborers as chattel or property. Additionally, these laws defined the descendants of African American mothers as black, regardless of the race of their father, and specified that they were to be enslaved for life. Interracial relationships were prohibited, but it still wasn't uncommon for slave children to have a white father and a black mother, because slave women were property and couldn't refuse. By the late 17th century, Virginia plantation owners were granted the legal right to kill their enslaved laborers if they defied the owner's authority. And in 1680, a law was added to make it illegal for any black person to possess weapons of any kind. Enslaved people also could not legally leave their plantation without formal permission from the slave owner. But those who were sold into these harsh conditions didn't just accept their fate. They found ways to resist this dehumanizing institution, both covertly and overtly. Ways that they covertly resisted the conditions of slavery was to secretly practice cultural customs from their homelands. Others kept their belief systems and continued to speak their native languages. They continued to practice the naming practices for their children, even if they also had to follow the customs of their owners as well. Still others slowed the pace of work, even resorting to breaking tools and damaging crops. But this type of resistance wasn't what white planters were particularly worried about. They worried more about overt resistance, especially rebellion, particularly in the areas where the black enslaved population was in the majority, like it was in the British West Indies and in the southern colonies. In 1739 in South Carolina, an event known as the Stono Rebellion took place, when a small group of slaves stole weapons and proceeded to attack whites and burn plantations as they traveled along the Stono River. By the time the local militia caught them, their numbers had increased to about 50. The rebellion was crushed, with most of those who had rebelled being either killed in the fighting with the local militia or hanged afterwards, along with many who didn't participate at all and were simply hanged as an example. White planters had often tried to convince themselves that they were caretakers of a people who needed to be taken care of, and that their slaves were happy with this arrangement. But events like the Stono Rebellion was proof that this wasn't the case. Running away was another response that enslaved people took to resist the horrors of slavery. Some who escaped fled into the mountains or swamps, forming maroon communities that could serve as an inspiration to others. Many of these communities successfully resisted recapture and formed their own autonomous groups. One example of this is the maroon community located in the Great Dismal Swamp, located along the Virginia-North Carolina border. The precise number of people who lived there is unknown, but archaeologists have found evidence of thriving communities in what may have originally been an area as large as 1 million acres. These communities were even more common in British-controlled Jamaica, located inland away from the coasts. And of course, there was also running away northward into colonies where slavery was less common, and eventually where slavery was outlawed.